Hello and welcome to the Subversive Symposium, the series of conversations I'm having with legal historians to mark the publication of my book, Subversive Legal History, which argues that legal history should be at the beating heart of the law curriculum. And I'm joined today by Dr. Emily Ireland, lecturer in law, or lecture of law, I never quite know, of in, at...
Either or, I think.
Yeah, see lectures law, that's the headline, see lectures law at Liverpool. So welcome, Emily. Do you want to begin by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm a lecturer in/of law at Liverpool. So at the minute I am teaching equity. I only started at Liverpool last June, and it's my first proper academic job, so I'm sort of getting into the swing of that. My research is in legal history. I would consider myself to be a legal historian. I've never really written about anything else. I am mainly interested in the history of gender and the law, either in sort of a trusts equity kind of way or in a criminal law kind of way. So for my PhD, I looked at angry wives who sued their husbands in Chantry in the 18th century. I'm sort of, yeah, I guess interested in sort of bringing those voices to the fore a little bit more. That's me, basically.
Excellent. So sort of the PhD was focused, as you say, on sort of questioning further these ideas of coverture.
Yes,
that we have.
Right. Yeah, so I do a lot of work around married women and coverture and what that meant in the 18th and 19th century and how that impacted various different facets of the law. Yeah.
Which sort of traditionally in legal history has been sort of used as being the basis of sort of a paragraph or two, you know, or possibly a chapter here or there, rather than you know, and so I suppose what your research is doing, I suppose I know because I've heard you speak, and I've read your stuff. What your research does is it unpacks that, doesn't it, and looks at the Court of Chantry, which sort of sheds a different light on the whole sort of concept and debate.
Precisely, yeah. So I'm sort of trying to amalgamate kind of, I guess, some more doctrinal analysis with a bit more socio-legal analysis, because certainly for a long time, I think legal historians didn't tend to look at gender at all, I suppose, because you didn't get female lawyers and you didn't get female judges and you didn't even get female politicians for a long time. But sort of that has changed over the past sort of 30, 40 years. And there are an awful lot of really good sort of gender historians who work with legal documents and write about women in the law, as well as some legal scholars who now do that as well. So I guess I'm sort of part of that trend. But yeah, sort of trying to get out the sort of agency that these women were actually using and how they were actually interacting with the law, as opposed to just saying like, oh yeah, this is something that was plonked onto them and this is what happened.
Absolutely, yeah. Because of coverture is sort of seen as sort of the end of the conversation almost, rather than the starting point, isn't it? Very often.
Yeah.
And you know, what's also quite interesting with your stuff is that, as you were saying, you know, you're not looking at it solely from the perspective of criminal law or solely from the perspective of equity, but you're kind of combining the two, which leads to interesting and quite varied research activities, doesn't it? And
yeah, so I think that there is like a certain satisfaction that comes with when you've read about something for so long from so many different perspectives that you start to notice connections in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect it. So I've recently been doing some work on like married women and criminal law, and particularly women being indicted for sort of marketing offences, I guess you would call them. And what I've kind of dubbed a sort of informal defence of legal impossibility. So basically, they turn up and they say, well, okay, like, yes, I've been indicted for selling gin without a license. But because I'm a married woman and because of coverture, I'm not actually allowed to own that gin, and I wasn't allowed to sell that gin. So what are you going to do, judge? And an awful lot of the judicial responses are quite similar, or kind of have affinity to some of the stuff that was happening with trust law and married women's separate property ownership. And I can kind of see these parallels because I've kind of looked at both of them. So it's kind of interesting, satisfying almost, to have sort of got to the point where I can kind of see the connections between the two, I guess.
Yeah, and I suppose they're sort of legal connections, and dare I say sort of societal connections, because you can then kind of really put these things into context and sort of, you know, you're right, actually, you're absolutely right. But, you know, when we talk about putting law into context, a lot of that is the precursor to that is putting this body of law in the context of that body of law as well.
Yes.
Because, you know, all the distinctions we draw between different areas of the law are abstract, artificial, and, you know, historically it's historical sort of creations.
Yeah.
So
and
yeah,
that brings out sort of diversity of experiences at law as well, because obviously, despite the fact my married women, for example, were using trust law in the same way, because of coverture, they had a completely different experience to sort of like just a bloke who would have turned up and gone to Chancery, for example. Children, you know, also impeded from accessing the law in the same way. And they also have a completely different experience. So yeah, kind of like superimposing these things on top of each other is quite a good way of getting to the diversity of experiences people have when they go to law, I think.
Yeah,
probably still.
Absolutely, and sort of, you know, also then questioning what is the orthodox account, because all of a sudden you've got these other experiences. And you know, to what extent actually are they the predominant experience rather than what we've sort of been presented as being the you know, default, if that makes sense.
Yes, that is interesting. I'm wondering the extent to which we can kind of link that up to some of the stuff in your book about the sort of internal, external distinction in legal history, and whether, this is interesting, I don't know the answer, sort of internal means also sort of looking from the dominant perspective, and external means looking from different perspectives, or actually you can do looking from different perspectives within an internal tradition. I don't know.
I mean, that's a very, very good point, because sort of, yeah, you know, the internal approach to legal history, which is sort of the doctrinal approach, to give some sort of explanation for what the internal approach to legal history is, that which is the study of law legally. So it's the study of legal sources, it's the study of legal institutions, it's keeping inside what Robert Gordon called the box of law. And yeah, I mean, I think the risk there is that because you're doing that, you're kind of perpetuating the idea that law is autonomous, and you're perpetuating the idea, aren't you, I would have thought, that where you're perpetuating the myths you're told about law, which would include this sort of more conservative story and this more conservative perspective. I mean, yeah, I hadn't sort of thought of it like that. And I suppose, you know, the issue is, as I say in the book, it's the internal approach to legal history where you'd find people who would call themselves legal historians. And the external approach tends to be by people who are interested in law and history, often in law schools, not exclusively, but often in law schools, and they wouldn't call themselves legal historians. But I've noted you at the start of this conversation, I say the start, it was minutes ago, but you sort of said quite proudly, I would call myself a legal historian. So how do you get into legal history?
Well, Russell, let me tell you a story about how the Pope is responsible for my career choice.
Right, okay. Wow. I mean, this isn't would I lie to you, but that's the kind of sort of statement you'd get there. Right, wow. So the Pope is responsible for your career choice. Right, okay. Tell me more. Wow.
So I basically accidentally landed upon a legal history module when I was in my third year of university. And this happened because, like every second year student, when it got to the summer, the module selection for third year, which included all of the optional modules, was sort of released on a particular day. And you had to select modules, and then you would be on those for the rest of the year. And I had somehow wangled a couple of weeks off from my job in retail at the time, and had decided that I was going to take myself traveling. And I was in Rome on the particular day that the modules were released. And I kind of noticed on the email that they hadn't given a time for when this was going to happen. And it was my final day in Rome, and I'd sort of seen a few different sightseeing bits and bobs, but I'd not been to the Vatican City, which, I mean, I'm not particularly religious, but it's kind of interesting because it's a city and a place that people know of. Anyway, so I decided that maybe, or I'd risk it, and I would go to the Vatican City. And so I jumped on a bus and I went there, and I queued up to get into the cathedral, and they said, you can't come in the cathedral because you're wearing shorts. So I went and bought a scarf and I wrapped the scarf around me. I went back and they were like, yes, you can come in the cathedral now. And I sort of stepped into the cathedral in the Vatican City, and my friend from law school sent me a text saying, oh, they've released the modules. So I sprinted out and I jumped in a taxi and I went back to the hostel I was staying in, and I logged on to the world's slowest computer in the computer room of this hostel. And I had not really engaged very much with my law degree up until this point. I think I'd done sort of history A level and then got to the end of school, and I think maybe similarly to what Gwen was saying in your last symposium, kind of thought, oh, well, maybe I'll do law because I've got good grades. I don't really know. So it wasn't necessarily something that I was really, really enjoying, but there was this module called Gender, Sexuality and the Law that was a third year module, and I wanted to do it so badly. And the reason why I had sprinted out of the Vatican City was because I wanted to get on this module. So I'm there logging into this computer in the hostel, and then I go to select Gender, Sexuality and the Law, which is gonna be the saving grace of my law degree. I'm gonna love it. It's gonna be the best thing ever. And it's already full up. Oh. And I was gutted, and I cried, and I rang my mom and I rang the university, and there was just no way that I was going to be allowed onto this module. So eventually I kind of thought, oh, well, I guess I probably ought to see what else there is available and select something else, because I'm not going to get on this Gender, Sexuality and the Law module. And I had a look, and the only thing that was available was this module called Legal History. And I was like, oh gosh, oh, that sounds so boring. I can't believe this has happened to me. And I remember talking to my mum at the time and saying how disappointed I was. And she was like, oh, well, sometimes like, things happen for a reason. Like, maybe this will be okay. I was like, no, it's going to be awful. But I went and did it and loved it. It was all about the history of criminal law during the period of the Bloody Code. So much of it was, to me, just so interesting and also a little bit silly. So stuff like benefit of the clergy, every single person claiming that they're a priest or whatever, is very silly. And it was sort of the first time that I'd sort of realised that law could be fun. It doesn't have to be this serious thing that we're all extremely deferential to. Like, you can almost poke fun at it sometimes. And I think it was kind of the only thing that I did at law school that I found inspiring, basically. So the problem with it, or with that course though, and I even knew at the time, was there was no talk about women at all. So after that I did a dissertation on female shoplifters, and it was medium, but it kind of set me off on a track, and yeah, that's why the Pope is responsible for my career.
Wow, I mean that's a heck of a story. And also what I love about that is it really does capture that sort of, what I talk about the book, of that sort of stereotypical image of legal history as being, well, dull and sort of archaic, and just out of date law, and why you look at that for.
Exactly. I mean, I'm sort of thinking about potentially setting up a legal history module at Liverpool, proposing that soon. And sort of one of the things that I'm really aware of is the fact that if I call it legal history, then chances are students are going to have the same reaction as I had. They're not going to be interested. So I'm sort of wondering how I can frame it in a way that captures what it's about and why it's important, but it's not just kind of like legal history, because it's an image problem, I think.
Absolutely. But also there's that kind of contradiction there as well, in that in order to get students to pick a module, you want the attractive, sort of slightly sort of off-piste title. But also there's research, albeit from yonks ago. I mean, I remember reading this research when I was a student. Okay, so this is seriously a long time ago. Because, when I was a student, they were still using abacuses. Yeah, I remember reading this research sort of back 2002, 2003 this was, where they said that law students weren't picking certain modules because they were concerned that if they picked a module with an odd title, it would be on their CV, and that employers would look down their nose at it. Whereas actually what I've always found is the opposite. Back in the day when I used to teach law and religion, the number of students who said to me, oh, it came up in the interview for the training contract or whatever, because they were looking at my CV and going, what the hell's that? And I was able to talk to them about it, and I looked rather intelligent when talking to them about it, they said, and I was like, oh, must have something right there. You haven't learned that from me. Yeah, so I think whether the pendulum might have gone the other way in the 20 years since, but yeah, it's weird. I mean, we've had at Cardiff, there was historically a legal history course taught by the fantastic Tom Watkin, and I was the last student to, or the last part of the last cohort of students to take that course. And then for probably about 10 years, there was no legal history course at Cardiff. And then I brought it back. And originally it was very similar, actually. It's the course which I was taught. Because what you do, you kind of perpetuate what you're taught, don't you? But we now ask in tutorial 1, question 1, the first task is, because the first tutorial is on the importance of legal history, question mark. And the first task is, why have you picked this module? And what's striking is most of them have done A-level law, A-level history rather, and have enjoyed that. Or the memory of that is more pleasant than the instant memory of their law degree. Anyway.
I see. Yeah.
So it sort of fell a bit flat because I was going down around the room. So, what's your reason? What's your reason? Did A-level history, liked it. And actually A-level history these days is much more varied than it used to be. But yeah, and then others sort of say, well, yeah, it's about providing the context, and then you get a couple which give me your story, right? Which is sort of, by the time I was doing the options, there was nothing else there. or I couldn't actually have the option I wanted.
Yes, you get some stragglers, yeah.
I mean, when I was head department, it was particularly awkward one year because I was going around the room and I said to one student, so why have you picked this module? And he was like, because you stopped me from picking whatever the other module was. So it was like, I'm going to struggle to win you back this year.
Well, it would be funny if like the end of that story was like, and now he's my PhD student.
That's, yeah, I mean, sometimes things work, but in my situation, it didn't. I think he did well. If he's watching this, you did very well. But yeah, I mean, that's a heck of a story to then. But what's interesting about it is that you kind of didn't then do the masters on something that you'd been taught about substantively, but kind of applied the spirit of the course and almost kind of applied it back on the course in a sense. So sort of, applied it back in terms of, in the language I use, the book, the course, the module on legal history sort of subverted your expectations in certain ways,
yes,
but didn't subvert it in another way, in that it was sort of male. And so you kind of subverted the subverted thing, if that makes sense.
Extra subversion on top of the subversion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose sort of by that point I was already, forming my thoughts about kind of, I guess, being a feminist and sort of women's issues and that kind of thing. And I suppose that kind of, those two things just came together in a way that then sort of informed the rest of my research and has done ever since.
Absolutely. And was that a kind of a reaction not just to that legal history module, but to the law degree as a whole? In terms of, did you think the law degree as a whole was very male?
I think, it was a huge...
we've got to be careful here because we both make an earning from the fact we teach a law degree.
Yeah.
So we need to proceed with a little bit of caution here.
Yes. I remember writing certain essays that sort of had feminist perspectives in them. I did law and criminology, so I didn't do sort of just a straight LLB, which maybe made the difference. I think the criminology in a lot of ways made things more bearable. Maybe I shouldn't say that, gosh.
Well, I did law and sociology and kind of felt the same.
Yeah.
Although by the end of it, I had been so indoctrinated into the preciseness of law that the lack of preciseness in sociology was starting to irritate me.
Interesting.
And then I did my PhD on combining the two, because I kind of felt by the end of the degree that I'd had sort of two separate degrees in law and sociology. And I was like, well, there should be more kind of interaction between these two.
Yeah. How easy was that to do? Did you find that quite difficult? Was it sort of, did it involve basically getting up to speed on two separate disciplines almost, and all the literature there? Or... Absolutely.
It was really difficult because what I didn't sort of, I was kind of already up on sort of sociological theory in relation to sort of religion, because that was the theme. So it was combining sort of this new field of law and religion and this established field of sociology of religion. And when I started it, I thought, oh, the tricky bit is probably going to be the law and religion stuff, because that's new and that's emerging and that's not really a discipline yet. But that was the easier bit, really, because what I didn't, and it took me ages and ages and ages to get to this point, was I didn't realize how pivotal the sociology of law was going to be as kind of a bridge between the two. And I should have known, because an article by my supervisor, Norman Doe, which was sort of the catalyst for the whole PhD, said that in a sentence, right? And sort of said, the sociology of law will be important, but when you're young, you're arrogant, and you sort of, I'd obviously read this article to death, but I'd missed that one line. And once I got my head around that bit, it kind of made sense. But yeah, it was very tricky in terms of mastering two completely, or in some cases, three sort of different sub-disciplines.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it wasn't so much about the content, it was more about the culture. And the different ways of making an argument and the different ways of forming it, and different ideas about authority.
Yeah.
I
wonder, like, this is, you could just as easily have been talking about the differences between law and history, right? And
absolutely.
The differences in approach and how a historian would look at a source versus how a lawyer would look at a source, which I think sort of you talk about a little bit in your book. And again, it's sort of the internal external thing to a certain extent. And I sometimes wonder the extent to which it's just really hard to get your head around basically two different sets of literature, and that actually individuals working on their own is not the way forward, in the sense that actually, as you rightly say, it's about conversations, and it's about collaboration, and it's about opening up a dialogue between scholars who use the same sources to do different things, and that actually that's going to be a more successful approach, a way of doing legal history in the future.
Absolutely. I mean, to some extent, it's the same argument I've made in both books. It's a different context. You know, it's sort of, after a while, you kind of come to the realization there are certain sort of themes which you kind of keep revisiting. And I'll be honest, I do it subconsciously. I was only having sort of written the first draft of this, it sort of dawned on me that it was sort of a variation of this same idea, which is basically, you know, there's these two camps, and that's not helpful. And wouldn't it be great if they talked to each other? And I'm not saying that this camp suddenly needs to be doing what this camp does, because this camp has the expertise to do that particular thing. This camp might not have that expertise, but nevertheless, because they're dealing with the same thing, or elements of the same thing, they could learn from each other. It's kind of like the sort of the parable, the story of the elephant. You know, there's some people, blind people feeling different parts of the elephant. And you kind of, I felt like that in relation to religion. I feel like that more broadly in relation to, well, history, really.
No, I think you're spot on. I think definitely it's unrealistic to expect any one individual to be able to do both of these things well, and that maybe collaboration is the way forward. I don't know. I think I used to have this idea that maybe sort of more doctrinal legal historians didn't go in for the socio-legal thing because they thought that it was irrelevant or not as important. But actually, I sort of, I don't know, through conversations more recently, have a feeling that maybe actually it's quite a big task to do socio-legal work. And it's just doing a different thing. And maybe it's even a little bit scary if you've always just been taught law, to then sort of have to go off and think about social history. It's sort of apples and oranges to a certain extent, and sort of if you're really good at just doing doctrinal stuff, then yeah, cool, okay, you stay there, just don't, you know, realize that there's other stuff out there and that there are other people doing important stuff too.
And that might feed in and inform what you're doing.
Exactly.
But yeah, it you know, even it comes down to sources, doesn't it? You know, I mean, I'm not trained in any way, shape, or form to read diaries, or you know, or whatever, but you know, whereas I am trained to read case law, I am trained to read statute. I mean, it you know, it's sort of, but yeah, it is scary. But I do find the things that are the most scary are often the most fun. Perhaps I'm that's perverse, I don't know, but it's sort of,
No, I think, you know, if you go to Alton Towers, it's going to be the biggest roller coaster that gives you the biggest thrill.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, I would never go on a roller coaster. There's sort of, you know, my fun, my risk taking it still requires me to keep 2 feet very firmly on the ground.
Okay, intellectual risk taking.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Metaphorically, in that it's sort of, and I mean, that's why I sort of fell into the history stuff over the last 5-7 years or whatever, was that sense of the fun of something a little bit different. And also, I mean, I to go back to your Pope story, what I really loved about that was the idea that sort of history was silly, and there's stuff there which, because you're operating on a sort of a broader canvas, and also because you're operating with stuff which is further removed from you, you can be more creative, you can play with it more. Whereas I spent 10 years writing about religion, trying desperately all the time to take the heat out of the argument.
Right.
You know, just to sort of to go, yeah, there's this big debate about religious dress or whatever. But this piece is going to focus on what the law is and whether the law is actually helping people or frustrating people, that kind of thing. And so yeah, I find the history stuff just fun, but it's fun because it constantly sort of reveals my ignorance. It constantly I didn't know that. I mean, there's still stuff about normal religion I don't know. I'm not saying for a second I knew everything. But you know, you're sort of stumbling through this, and that's the fun of teaching legal history as well, because that's necessarily a broader thing than just what you would be kind of, you know, researching.
Yes, this is true. Yeah, no, I agree that I think when I was writing my PhD, it was the sort of juicy gossip, the sort of you know, the infidelity and the impotency and various other things that were the things that were keeping me going at certain points, I think. You know, counterbalanced to some of the more dry doctrinal stuff. Yes, I suppose there is also a risk that you become slightly desensitized. My family came out to visit me. I did write my thesis in Adelaide at the university there, and they came to visit me in Australia one Christmas, and we went and walked around the Adelaide jail. It's like a museum, and I thought it was great. There was loads of stuff about kind of like public executions, and sort of like they had kind of like the sites where various people had been executed, and I was like getting really into kind of like the sort of I don't know, I suppose the legal or almost the social history of all of this stuff. And then after a while I realized that I couldn't find my family anywhere, so I headed back to the entrance, and I found them all sort of slumped at the entrance, and they were like, God, it's depressing, this place, isn't it? It's really sad. And I was like, oh, I think something bad has happened to me, because I'm really inspired by this. I think maybe, I don't know, if you read about people being hung for long enough, then you sort of start, I don't know, blinkers come on and you start thinking about them as people. So I try to avoid that now, try to think about the people I'm writing about as people, and, you know, with thoughts and feelings. And
that itself, I think, is sort of a key characteristic of the type of legal history which you're doing, and the type of legal history which the sort of the externalists, I can call them that, are doing, in that it's about sort of reading back in, or putting back in the people, and a more sort of grounded approach. Ian Ward, in his brilliant book on English legal histories, I think it's called, says, you know, there's a risk of forgetting the faces, and nowhere is that risk greater than in legal history, because you kind of, you know, you're talking about sort of kings, queens, politicians, but it's easy to, you know, if you're giving that institutional account, it's very easy to sort of forget about people. And yeah, I think that's important. But as you say, it's also tricky. It's you know, which stories do you tell?
Yes, and I suppose there would be a camp as well who would argue that it's important to remain. Oh well, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that anybody can be entirely objective when they're doing history, but I suppose it's important to avoid presentism. But I guess that's a slightly different thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and yeah, it's every sort of interpretation in law or indeed in history is obviously there's elements of subjectivity there.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Once you start then sort of delving into that sort of grounded approach, it seems much less objective. In that, you know, why are you telling that person's story, not that person's story? Why are you emphasizing it that way, not that way?
Subjective thing, or something that's sort of adjacent to that, in relation to the counterfactual legal history chapter in your book, which I had absolutely never heard of before. This was kind of new to me, and sort of like the thing that made sense was the feminist legal judgments. That was my way in, and also the description of sliding doors. That was helpful. And I was thinking, I suppose, about the extent to which this is different to sort of how, or whether it is even sort of more untrue than how we do history anyway, which is maybe slightly controversial. But I think there's certainly a camp of people who kind of describe doing history in itself as sort of like responsible fiction. And I guess this kind of idea that actually you are inferring an awful lot from sometimes a very small amount of documents, and you're constructing a narrative, and that narrative will have kind of like subjectivity in it. That, you know, you're basically saying probably it's true, but actually you don't know for sure, and it could be that actually something else entirely happened. And I guess that there is a debate about whether history in itself is sort of about saying what factually happened, or whether it's more about sort of building these narratives and having these debates. But then does that mean that counterfactual history is sort of just actually one step beyond that, and that it's slightly more untrue? Or is it actually that it's one step behind that, because instead of kind of like presenting something as perhaps this is what happened, but sort of hiding the fact that it's only a perhaps, you're saying this absolutely didn't happen, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of it like that, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's an argument. What's fascinating, and the counterfactual history chapter was one of two chapters which were very much what we talked about a minute ago in terms of, you know, the fun of something which I knew nothing about when I started research. I had a book on my shelf 10 years ago on counterfactual history, and I remember looking at it and flicking through it, so 10 years ago, and thinking, this is interesting. I wonder how that would apply in relation to law. And so when I then came to expand this into a book, because originally it was just going to be an introductory chapter for something else, and sort of I realized I had too much for an introductory chapter, so it then became a short book, it then became a long book. When it became the long book, that idea, which was sort of there from sort of 10 years ago, came back to the surface in terms of, ooh, right, yes, I could now play with that. And yeah, you're right, but actually what was fascinating is there's sort of, on the one hand, you've got people saying counterfactual history is not real history, it's science fiction. It's something which proper historians don't do. And then you've got other people who say something very similar to what you've just said, in terms of saying, actually, it's what we do all the time. It's so endemic. We are so constantly thinking about what if. We're always looking at possible trajectories, possible alternatives. We're doing it anyway. And yeah, you know, I really like what you say in terms of, is then coming up with the false narrative, the path not taken, actually not as subversive as carrying on with the story as it happened, and looking at sort of possible alternative trajectories that way, kind of like a sort of a tree branch. Is it more interesting to carry on and to look at then other alternatives and to sort of to have the counterfactual debate, but not to then to create the counterfactual result? Yeah,
I wonder. I mean, I'm not. I don't want to set out my stall on this one because I'm, not well versed in the debate around counterfactual history generally. But I do wonder whether there is scope to do stuff with it that actually could sort of diversify sort of the voices that you get in legal history generally, which is often so limited by the sources that you have available. It kind of reminds me, when I was at UCL doing my master's, I did a history course, and one of the articles we had to read was somebody, I can't remember who, they'd sort of developed a theory and written an article on the idea of lesbian-like, and basically the author had taken some examples of sort of close female friendships throughout history and was sort of making the argument that, well, that we can't, there's not very much evidence of, solid evidence of lesbian relationships in history, because, these were by definition just hidden. But we can kind of infer that maybe, these people were actually in a relationship, but we don't know. And counterfactual history seems kind of similar to that. I don't know whether
absolutely,
you agree with that or not. But similarly, I wonder whether you could use counterfactual legal history to sort of like, I don't know, almost imagine what would happen if a person sort of from a subordinated group was put into a particular situation, or whether that would actually be sort of disrespectful. Or sort of changing the narrative too much, not reflective enough. I don't know. I haven't decided. It's just
No, that's a good point, because I think the counterfactual stuff highlights different possibilities and different interpretations. So and I hadn't thought of it in that way. So that's really a good point. And then that could very well reveal a particular perspective which has been silenced or which has been ignored. So counterfact, that kind of looking for alternative explanations. So in relation to a story of law reform, going back beyond the sort of the day when it was decided, this is the way we're going to go beyond, before that decision, you might then find the kind of stories that you're talking about, rather than needing to invent them. But I think there probably is a place for pure invention. There is a place for sort of a hybrid almost of sort of law and history, law and literature, law and sort of creativity almost, in terms of, using that as a way to kind of to see the reality in a different way.
Perhaps.
Perhaps, I don't know.
Incredibly unscholarly.
Well, I mean, this is where we sort of get into the criticism of counterfactual history being science fiction, because that's basically what science fiction does, or it's one of the functions of what science fiction does, is that it's about sort of, looking at the human condition and human reality from a place of fiction. And that's what literature does. Actually, it's broader than sci-fi. But that's a
it's
really
interesting anyway. I'm sort of really interested in sort of how you can basically sort of cherry pick theories from other places and pop them into legal history and see how that works or doesn't work. I've sort of one of my PhD supervisors was in the history department, not the law department, and she did lots of stuff with the history of emotions, and I've sort of since written a book chapter about sort of law and emotion in Chancery, and that was really interesting to sort of like use a completely different methodology and apply it to law. Something that I think also the like legal history or the discipline or the people in the discipline is welcoming as well, because there was a special issue of the Journal of Legal History recently that was similarly on law and emotions and the history of emotions. So
yeah, I mean that's fascinating. I think it's again, it's about sort of looking at what's in front of you from a different angle in a different way, and it's great in a sense that sort of, you know, there's already movement in that direction. And, you know, I think the arguments I make in Subversive Legal History would have been even more pronounced had I been writing it 10, 20 years ago. We're already moving in the direction that I talk about. And I remember being in the drafting process, that kind of did bother me a bit in terms of, you know, when you're sort of talking about the problem, the extent to which you then say, well, yeah, there are people who've moved beyond this, but they're exceptional. And so the fact that they're exceptional means that it's still a problem. But yeah, you know, it kind of gets in the way of the prose if you've got to keep on saying, you know, with notable exceptions.
But also, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of it's yeah. I when I was feeling particularly pretentious one day, I sort of thought, yeah, I'm dealing you in ideal types. But that was by most of the pretentious, I think. But yeah, it is definitely an issue, and you know, it's sort of particularly, and you know, there has been particularly over the last 5 years, I think, this sort of renewed emphasis on gender, which is reflected in your own work, and you know, it's not the case, I don't think, that legal history is completely immune from the developments in history as a whole. There may be a slight sort of delayed reaction.
There's definitely a delayed reaction. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I suppose maybe there's just less people doing it. So it's slower. Maybe it's something about the fact that it is this kind of weird offshoot that is not really law and not really history, that means that sort of taking on board anything from either takes longer. I've never been really sure about that. Maybe it's just that it's not finished.
Yes.
Like, you know, we still don't know so much about how the law actually operated for so much of history, and that sort of that still needs to be done.
Yeah, and you know, you've been working as well on the sort of post-revolutionary period, haven't you?
Yeah.
And that is really a sort of a slightly untapped area, because we kind of had sort of, you know, by and large, Maitland and his successors have done the medieval period. Sir John Baker has done the Tudor period and the sort of the early Stuarts. But now, and lots of people have done sort of, you know, lots of stuff about the 19th century, although there's still lots to be done there, because it's much more sort of, you know, complicated and nuanced, because it's the century of reform, it's the century of legislation. You know, there's more bloody law, to put it, you know, bluntly.
It's endless law, it's everywhere. Gosh.
Yeah, exactly. It's at every level, as I think E.P. Thompson put it. You know, it's every bloody way. I think that might be paraphrased as quote, but that's definitely, you know, what you get from it. But yeah, there's so much more to do, which is the exciting thing, and so many things which, as we've been discussing, that sort of, even if it feels if it's done, it's not done, because it can be looked at in a new way. Your work with coverture, for instance, you know, combining the equity and combining criminal.
Yes, or I wonder if is that the reason why there's not like a good textbook on it for like undergrads?
Possibly, yeah, because how do you frame it? I mean, I've spent the last 7 years trying to write one, and I mean, Sir John Baker's book is brilliant.
Yep.
And it's the only one, and obviously that takes a particular approach, which is sort of by topic, which doesn't necessarily fit that well with the way in which we teach legal history at Cardiff, which is more sort of chronological. And so and the amount of, I wouldn't say sleepless nights because that's overplaying it, I sleep well, but the amount of anguish that's given me in terms of, and my computer is full of various different tables of contents, trying to work out how to split it up, and what to cover and what not to cover. And it's that that is the issue. I mean, Ian Ward published with Hart last year a fantastic book which covers modern legal history. We've got the second edition of I think it's the Cornish book, isn't it, on that as well. But yeah, it's how do you frame the subject, which I think then also becomes a how do you teach it.
Yes, how do you make it accessible?
Yeah.
How do you sort of get students to kind of put the idea of this sort of like cohesive jurisdiction out of their heads and sort of think about the fact that actually if you go back 300 years or further, you've got all sorts of weird jurisdictions everywhere, all over the place, and they're talking to each other, but sometimes they're not entirely agreeing with each other and they're all doing different things. It's tricky to get your head around. Well, I find it tricky. So
I find it almost impossible at times. I mean, the amount of times I'm sitting in this chair, in this room, sort of struggling over something and swearing at something, to be perfectly blunt. Absolutely. But it also then makes sense of what the law students are currently studying. You're teaching equity and trusts. That learned historically is just baffling, or at least I found it baffling.
I mean, I'll be honest, I think they're finding it baffling anyway. But yeah, this is the first time I've taught modern equity. It's the first time I've taught in an English law school, and I was almost sort of surprised by how historical equity as a subject actually is. I didn't necessarily remember that from my law degree. I had a funny experience of getting kind of like the reading all of the cases for the first introductory seminar, and sort of like all of the cases up to about 1850. I was like, oh yeah, know those. And then after, no, I didn't. And I guess most people have it the opposite way around. They'll know the more recent cases and they won't know sort of like the historical ones. So I don't know, we did a lot of talking about the common law writ system and how equity came in to mitigate the harshness of the common law and various other things at the beginning of term. And I think they got it, but time will tell, I suppose.
Time always does tell. And it's sort of, it's odd, isn't it? Because sort of that sort of story of the common law is almost, the greatest story rarely told now. Because we don't directly tell it to law students. We kind of expect them to kind of know it by just to have picked it up in the air. And it's not a particularly sort of well-rehearsed story. And the accounts in textbooks now is much reduced from what it used to be. There's exceptions, as there always are. But it is striking how sort of less historical student textbooks are, and are likely to become even more as they focus more on getting students to know the answers to multiple choice questions for the SQE. But yeah, it's another way of bringing in history as well, isn't it? It's in addition to that sort of optional module thing we've talked about, how can we smuggle it in to the law curriculum?
Yeah, can you just sneak it in across the board, just make it sort of put more emphasis on it in just all of those required modules, or do it really early on as part of a kind of introduction to the law thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and sort of, you know, in the textbook, not the text, in the Subversive Legal History book, I kind of raise that as an issue of where do you teach it, and then I quickly move on, because I think that sort of institutional thing of, you know, how do you timetable it? Do you put it? Do you do it as a separate module? Do you weave it in? Do you do it as a first year module? That is so specific to specific institutions and specific cultures and specific people that, you know, you can't be prescriptive about it. And I just think it doesn't really matter in the end, as long as it's there somewhere.
Yeah, I think you're right. It also, I guess the whole thing speaks to a broader problem, doesn't it? Which is more just about the way law degrees are taught in general, and the lack of sort of different perspectives. Like you talk about it towards the end of this book. I'm pointing down here because I've got it here.
Right, excellent, fantastic.
But you talk about legal history as a method, I think.
Yes.
And one of many methods, and also sort of like the way that sort of all these core modules are taught. They are taught from a particular perspective, and that in itself is a particular method. So stuff like legal theory is maybe a little bit more ingrained in law schools, but there are still loads of law schools in the UK that sort of don't have a legal theory module, or it's not compulsory. I suppose sort of there's like international perspectives, there's all the various different Marxist feminist stuff, and is it just that we need to overhaul the whole thing? Oh, this is super radical, but and actually start again and actually give more equal weighting to all of these different ways of looking at the law, and that way, because like how closely linked is a qualifying law degree to actually anything that you do in practice anyway?
Absolutely, yeah.
Do we just need to flatten it all and start again and build it up in a completely different way?
I mean, I completely agree, and I think it's you know, the skills which you need in practice, whether that's practice as a lawyer or any other professional role, is the kind of thinking outside the box, critical skills, seeing things from numerous different perspectives, which doctrinal legal study on its own doesn't develop. And you know, I think one of the key problems, and I think I say this in the book, is that we don't identify doctrinal legal method as a method. We just take that as the default. If, by contrast, you take that as a method, then the next logical question is, what other methods are there which we can use? Not all the time, but you know, when it's relevant.
Yep.
And you know, for me, history is one of those methods. You know, social science methods are another cluster of methods. But you know, there's this problem, but we sort of think the default is the doctrinal, and it's so much the default we don't see it as a method. And then when we talk about interdisciplinarity, we instantly go to the social sciences.
Yep.
You know, it's sort of, but as we've been discussing, I think, you know, there are positive moves in the other direction. You know, there's definitely much more being done on sort of gender in the law, generally, not just in legal history, than there was even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. There's much more being done on race in the law.
Yeah, well, empire, colonialism.
Exactly.
In legal history at the minute.
Yeah. You know, so it's sort of, you know, things are, well, I think we're getting more and more subversive.
I think so. They're just going to become subversive.
Yes, indeed, and that's really our aim, to become even more subversive. And who knows? So in 10 years' time, we have to be even ultra subversive. We'd have to create a whole new vocabulary. But there we go. Excellent. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, Emily, about your own work and about subversive legal history, and like I say, you know, how the Pope put you on this career. and you know, and the stuff you're producing is really interesting, and really sort of really reflects the developments in legal history. In that, you know, what you're doing is you're bringing together rich doctrinal analysis and then rich external analysis. So that's great to see, and it's been great to talk about. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. This has been lots of fun.
Excellent.